Wittgenstein was born in 1889. He was born to a very wealthy family of industrialists in Austria. They were a very cultured, cultivated family, Jewish. And he initially began with an interest in engineering, and as a result of that he became interested in mathematics, and then in turn the philosophy of mathematics, and that was what took him initially to work with Russell in Cambridge in the early 20th century, first decade of the 20th century. And that was where he first systematically came across a sort of revolution in logic and its implications for philosophy. And it was a result of a very intensive period of 4 or 5 years, maybe more, in Cambridge working with Russell, that led to his first book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which he was working on over a period of years in the second decade of the 20th century. And then he was drafted for the First World War and finished off the book in a prisoner of war camp towards the end of that war. The book was published after a certain amount of difficulty early in the 20s, and in effect, in large part because he thought he'd pretty much solved all the essentials of the problems in philosophy that he was interested in, he gave up the subject, abandoned academic life altogether, spent some time teaching at a primary school. He also worked as a gardener. He devoted a certain amount of time to designing and helping to build a house for one of his sisters. And then towards the end of the 20s, he was gradually sucked back into philosophy, partly through conversations with members of the Vienna Circle. He went back to Cambridge, submitted the Tractatus, his first book, as his thesis, and began teaching again more and more systematically in the 1930s. This was the period in which the later philosophy, the second major phase of his thinking, evolved and developed. It was largely circulated through typescripts and manuscripts. And although he never really finished the single definitive expression of that later philosophy that he was working on in that period, most of the work in what was posthumously published as the Philosophical Investigations was done by the end of the 30s, beginning of the 40s. And after the Second World War, he in effect gave up his chair and abandoned academic life again, and spent the last few years of his life working on a range of topics in the philosophy of psychology, in epistemology, and so on, visiting friends, staying with them, and he died eventually in 1951. So his general upbringing was within the sort of high bourgeois culture of Central Europe at the end of the 19th century. He was a reader of Freud. He was particularly impressed by Schopenhauer as a cultural figure. Some of the wealth that he inherited from his family he devoted to supporting writers and thinkers. Karl Kraus, for example, was someone who was quite influential. So there were a range of intellectual influences there for him. Music was very important in his life. He spent most of the rest of his time as a philosopher in England. I'm not sure that English culture was particularly influential in those respects. I think intellectually the most significant element of influence on him was the revolution in logic that I mentioned earlier, which was primarily associated with the names of Frege and Russell. And here, in effect, Wittgenstein becomes one of the major figures in one of the most influential movements in Anglo-American philosophy, certainly in the 20th century. It usually goes under the heading of analytic philosophy. And what was in effect happening in Cambridge at the beginning of the 20th century was the evolution of a view of the problems of philosophy as being fundamentally based on a range of confusions that were rooted in a misunderstanding of the logic of our language, the means of representation through which we think about the world, through which we represent the world. And the work of Frege and of Russell in the early 20th century in effect massively increased the power of logical theory to cope with a much broader range of ordinary linguistic expressions. And the philosophical impact of that initially was meant to be primarily restricted to the field of mathematics. Frege was committed to a logicist program. He wanted to try and reduce mathematical propositions, mathematical truth, to a species of logical truth. And Russell, to a certain extent, was also interested in that project. That was the immediate interest. Gradually, though, it became clearer to the various people concerned, and particularly to Russell and Wittgenstein, I think, as well as G.E. Moore, who was another influential figure in Cambridge at the time, that essentially all of the basic problems that had preoccupied philosophers throughout the history of the discipline could be seen to be, as it were, not so much resolved as dissolved by using these new logical analyses in order to demonstrate the underlying structure, the sense or intelligibility of ordinary language. With these new logical tools, it turned out that the kinds of questions that philosophers were prone to ask, and which they found it incredibly difficult to discover answers to, as you can see from the fact that we're still worried about the sorts of problems Plato was worried about, were ultimately due to the fact that we misunderstood the underlying logical structure of our means of representing reality. And once, with the age of logic, we were able to clarify that underlying logical structure, it would turn out to be the case that there weren't any genuine questions for philosophy to answer. The Tractatus, which was the first of Wittgenstein's publications, indeed the only one that he published during his lifetime, is a sort of extreme crystallization of that analytical impulse. The book famously ends by suggesting that the fundamental problems of philosophy reduce themselves to confusions of various kinds. They end up in the articulation of nonsense. The Tractatus is the object of a great deal of interpretive controversy, but there is a basic standard story, what one might call the orthodox reading of the Tractatus, and it's maybe best to begin there. According to this way of reading the book, there is a fundamental insight into the nature of propositions, which goes under the heading of the picture theory of meaning. And the idea is that genuine, intelligible, empirical propositions function as a kind of depiction of the fact or state of affairs in the real world, which they mean to represent. Wittgenstein uses the resources of the predicate calculus, part of this revolution of logic that I've been talking about, in order to display the underlying structure of these pictures. And what that picture theory essentially shows is that the basic propositions of language are bipolar. That is, that they're necessarily capable both of being true and of being false. And in order for them to have that bipolarity, they have to share a logical form with the facts or states of affairs that they represent. And in order for that sharing of logical form to be possible, then Wittgenstein has to tell a story about an even more basic level of language. He claims that the elementary or basic propositions that do the depicting are themselves built up out of logically simple elements of language that he calls names. And they go proxy for equally simple elements of reality, out of which the corresponding fact or state of affairs is built. The relevant elementary proposition is true if and only if the corresponding state of affairs, the one constructed in the right way out of the corresponding simples, is indeed the case, does hold in reality. If not, then it's false. But fundamentally, what Wittgenstein's interested in is the conditions for the possibility of that bipolarity. And that resides in the fact that the names go proxy for the simples. So that's the basic story he tells about depiction in the Tractatus. He then deals with what are in effect a potential range of counterexamples to that very simple picture about propositional depiction. He talks in varying amounts of detail about propositions of mathematics, expressions of causal law in science, and so on. He's also interested in ethical or evaluative propositions more generally. But in order to understand what he says about those, one needs to recognize that there's a kind of tripartite taxonomy that structures the Tractatus. What we've been talking about so far in terms of the picture theory of meaning is the domain of the intelligible proposition. But Wittgenstein also identifies a category of propositions that he calls senseless, and a third category that he calls nonsensical. The senseless propositions are the tautologies and contradictions which he claims constitute the propositions of logic. They're what he calls degenerate cases of propositions. They have the right kind of structure, the right kind of logical structure to be propositions. They're made up of the right kind of constituents, and they're combined in perfectly licit ways by means of the logical connectives. But they are combined in such a way that the sense cancels out in these propositions. So what you end up with is something which is a perfectly legitimately constructed element of language, but it's one which ends up telling you nothing whatever in the way in which the proposition, either it's raining or it's not raining, is taken to tell you nothing whatever about the weather. And that was part of what was radical about the Tractatus, the claim that in effect all of the propositions of logic were essentially tautologies and contradictions, empty of sense, but not nonsensical. The category of nonsense is a very distinct one for Wittgenstein.